What if the future of the British monarchy didn't hinge on wars, politics, or treaties, but on a whisper at a funeral? Imagine a sacred space where silence should have spoken louder than words, suddenly pierced by a revelation so raw, so dangerous, it sent shockwaves through the centuries-old institution. That is exactly what unfolded at the Duchess of Kent's funeral. In the solemnity of mourning, Catherine, Princess of Wales, leaned in toward King Charles with words that would set Prince Harry ablaze with fury. Words that were not meant for the world to hear. Yet their consequences could change everything we thought we knew about the royal family. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about it. A funeral, a day of grief, black coats, lowered heads, hymns echoing off the stone walls of St. George's Chapel. The public watching on television, expecting unity, tradition, dignity. And yet, behind closed doors, or rather, within the pews of that sacred service, a battle was beginning. Not a battle fought with swords or soldiers, but with secrets. A battle where whispers held the weight of bombs. And at the heart of it all, a second book. Yes, you heard that right. Prince Harry, the very man who shook the monarchy to its core with his memoir Spare, was allegedly preparing another. One that promised to be even more explosive, even more devastating, even more personal. And Catherine decided the king needed to know, right then, right there. But why? Why risk it all at such a moment? Let me ask you something. What's more dangerous, silence or truth? Is it riskier to leave a king in the dark, or to whisper the very words that could fracture his fragile peace? Catherine, by all accounts, believed she was protecting the monarchy, shielding it from another betrayal. Yet to Harry, it was the ultimate act of treachery. "Shut up, Catherine," he reportedly snapped, his fury uncontained, his mask shattered. Can you picture it? The eyes of mourners turning, not fully understanding, yet sensing tension thick enough to cut with a blade. The future king, caught between the loyalty of a daughter-in-law and the rage of his son. It sounds like a scene from a drama, but this was no script. This was reality, unfolding in real time. But let's rewind for a moment. Why was Harry so furious? Why did Catherine feel compelled to say something so damning during such a sacred occasion? To answer that, we need to step back into the shadows of the past few years. Spare. The book that became more than a memoir, it became a weapon. With each page, Harry fired shots at the institution that raised him, nurtured him, and betrayed him. He exposed private conversations, family feuds, childhood wounds. He painted William as the aggressor, Camilla as the schemer, Charles as the distant father. And Catherine? Even she, the picture of composure, was not spared the ink of his pen. For the monarchy, the damage was incalculable. For Harry, it was liberation, or so he thought. Here's where the irony sharpens. After Spare, the world believed the bridge between Harry and Charles was burned beyond repair. Yet just a week before the funeral, headlines whispered of reconciliation. Harry had returned to Clarence House, the very home of his father, to sit down face to face. After months of silence, bitterness, and legal battles, they spoke. Reports suggest the meeting was emotional, even healing. Could it be that father and son were finally finding their way back to each other? That the monarchy, against all odds, might stitch itself back together? That fragile hope hung in the air as the nation mourned the Duchess of Kent. And then Catherine shattered it with a whisper. Now, I want you to think carefully. Why would Harry reconcile with his father if he was planning another attack in print? Contradictions. That's the heartbeat of this story. On one hand, the warm smiles at Clarence House. On the other, secret notes passed between publishers, rumors of meetings with ghostwriters, whispers of a manuscript more shocking than anything we've ever seen. Catherine believed the rumors. She feared Harry was smiling at Charles's face while sharpening a knife behind his back. And in her eyes, Charles needed to be warned before it was too late. But Harry? He saw it differently. From his perspective, Catherine's whisper wasn't loyalty. It was betrayal. Imagine being in his shoes. A man constantly accused of airing dirty laundry, finally daring to hope for reconciliation, only to realize his own sister-in-law was undermining him at his father's side. Is it any wonder the words, "Shut up," Catherine spilled out, raw and unfiltered? For Harry, Catherine wasn't protecting Charles. She was exposing him. She was dragging private intentions into the light in the most public, humiliating way possible. It wasn't just about the book, it was about trust. And in that moment, Harry lost his trust in Catherine forever. Let's not forget the symbolic weight of this funeral. The Duchess of Kent, a figure of old-world royalty, a symbol of duty and tradition, being laid to rest. And in that sacred space, the new generation of royals weren't honoring her legacy. They were tearing at each other's throats. Doesn't it make you wonder if the monarchy has truly learned anything from its history? Diana once spoke of silence, of secrets that suffocated her. Harry claimed to break that silence with spare. Now Catherine was breaking it again, but in the opposite direction, protecting the crown, not exposing it. Two women, two eras, both whispering truths that could change everything. And here's where it gets even more dangerous. The rumors of Harry's second memoir weren't just idle gossip. According to insiders, this new book could delve deeper into the darkest corners of royal life, stories that even Spare dared not tell. Allegations of betrayals, hidden scandals, unspoken truths about Diana's final years, even explosive claims about Camilla's rise to power. Can you imagine the damage such revelations could inflict on King Charles, barely steady on the throne, his health already a whispered concern? Catherine could imagine it. That's why she spoke. And Harry, realizing his secret, or his rumored secret, was now in Charles's ears, couldn't contain his rage. So where does that leave us? A funeral turned battlefield, a king caught in the middle, a princess branded both protector and betrayer, and a prince who may, or may not, be plotting another literary bombshell. This isn't just about family squabbles. This is about survival. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, divorces, and scandals. But can it survive the pen of one of its own? That's the haunting question echoing through the halls of Clarence House and Windsor today. But before you answer that, let me ask, what happens when reconciliation collides with revenge? Because not even a week before the funeral, Harry and Charles had embraced, smiled, even laughed together at Clarence House. They spoke of family, of healing, of moving forward. And yet, if Catherine's words were true, that very reconciliation was built on a lie that could unravel in the pages of a second memoir. Which means, if Catherine was right, Harry's return wasn't a gesture of love, it was a Trojan horse. And the king had just opened the gates. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Because the funeral, that somber day meant to honor the Duchess of Kent, wasn't just a farewell to a royal elder. It became the stage for whispers, glances, and an invisible war playing out between the living. And the setting itself? It mattered, more than anyone realized. Let's paint the picture. You have a cold September wind curling through the ancient stones of Windsor. The sky heavy with gray clouds, as if even heaven was in mourning. Black limousines rolling one after another through the gates, the polished boots of guards striking rhythmically on the cobblestones. The hush of the crowd outside, their phones raised, their eyes hungry for glimpses of grief and unity. Funerals, especially royal ones, are not just private moments of loss. They are theater, and this theater had the world watching. But inside, within the chapel, it was not theater. It was tension. Have you ever noticed how silence can speak louder than words? The soft organ music, the echo of footsteps on stone, the creak of a pew, it all seemed amplified. And in that silence, Catherine's whisper would land like thunder. Think about where everyone was seated. The cameras only gave us snippets, but eyewitnesses described the arrangement clearly. Charles near the front, shoulders bowed beneath both grief and duty. William beside Catherine, his jaw tight, his eyes betraying the strain of keeping composure. And Harry, isolated, not pushed to the very back, but not close enough to feel included either. That middle distance that says, you belong here, but not too much. It was a funeral seating chart, but it was also a map of fractured loyalties. And that's where the storm brewed. Now, funerals are supposed to bring families together, right? Shared tears, shared memories, shared humanity. But for the Windsors, funerals have often revealed cracks instead of healing them. Remember Diana's funeral? Young William and Harry walking behind that coffin, their grief on display for the world, while whispers already questioned how the monarchy would survive the shadow of Diana. Fast forward to Queen Elizabeth's funeral. Again, Harry's presence sparking debates about loyalty, betrayal, and the future of the firm. And here, at the Duchess of Kent's farewell, history seemed to be repeating itself. Only this time, it wasn't just about grief. It was about secrets. Let me ask you this. If you knew a storm was coming, would you whisper it in the king's ear during a funeral? Or would you hold your tongue, protecting the illusion of unity? Catherine chose the first path, and that choice turned a solemn ritual into a battlefield. Picture the moment. The hymn is ending, the voices fading into that eerie hush that only sacred spaces can carry. Catherine leans ever so slightly toward Charles. Her lips barely move, her words softer than breath. But in that softness lay a dagger. Harry is working on another book. Simple words, yet loaded with consequence. Why then? Why there? Some say Catherine calculated it perfectly. She knew Harry couldn't explode publicly without exposing himself. She knew Charles would feel the weight of her words most strongly in a place of reflection and remembrance. And she knew timing is everything, because reconciliation had just begun. This was her way of pulling the brakes before Charles drove blindly into betrayal. But for Harry, seated within earshot, the whisper wasn't strategy. It was humiliation. Imagine the sting. Your father, the king, being warned of your alleged treachery not in private, but in the hallowed walls of a funeral service. Catherine's whisper wasn't just a message, it was a spotlight. It illuminated him, exposed him, branded him the danger in their midst. Now here's the contradiction. Catherine's move was both bold and reckless. Bold because she risked Harry's wrath to protect the monarchy. Reckless because she underestimated Harry's inability to remain silent. That's why the words burst from him like sparks off dry tinder. Shut up, Catherine. Quiet, sharp, but unmistakable. Those around them froze, unsure if they had truly heard it. But Harry's face said it all. Fury, betrayal, raw emotion on display in a place meant for restraint. And here's where the funeral setting matters even more. Because it wasn't just about words exchanged in whispers. It was about optics. Every bow of the head, every flicker of expression, every glance caught by cameras told its own story. Body language experts would later dissect the footage. Catherine's composed stillness, William's protective stance, Charles's weary eyes darting between them, Harry's clenched jaw. The images became symbols of division. Ask yourself, was this still a funeral, or had it transformed into an arena? Because in that sacred space, surrounded by hymns and history, the monarchy wasn't just saying goodbye to the Duchess of Kent. It was confronting its own survival. And the irony? Funerals, for most families, are the moments when grudges soften, when enemies shake hands, when forgiveness feels possible. But for the Windsors, funerals seem to reopen wounds. It's as though grief pulls the masks off, leaving only raw truth behind. The setting amplified everything. The towering arches of the chapel reminded everyone of tradition. The centuries-old walls whispered of kings and queens who had come before, rulers who had faced wars, abdications, betrayals. But even those ancient stones had never held a secret quite like this. The prospect of a second Harry memoir, one that could unravel the monarchy from within. And if you think Catherine's whisper was the climax of the day, think again. It was just the beginning. Because whispers don't stay whispers for long. They ripple. They reach ears they weren't meant for. And that's exactly what happened next. Harry's fury wasn't just a passing outburst. It was the opening shot in a conflict that would follow the family out of the chapel, into Clarence House, and across the globe's headlines. The funeral was only the stage. The real drama was yet to unfold. But before that drama could break into the open, something else happened in that chapel, something no one outside those walls expected. And when it came to light, it proved that Catherine's whisper was not just a warning. It was a trigger, and the trigger had just been pulled. She leaned in, lips barely moving, voice softer than the hymn still echoing faintly in the vaulted chapel. Catherine's whisper wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to pierce the moment. Harry is working on another book. Now stop and think about that. Imagine being King Charles, still mourning the passing of his cousin, the Duchess of Kent, still wearing the weight of grief like a cloak. And then, in the middle of that sacred stillness, your daughter-in-law tells you that your son is preparing to detonate another literary bomb. A bomb bigger than spare. A bomb that could tear open wounds that had barely begun to scar over. Why would Catherine do it? Why not wait until after the service, after the funeral, after the cameras had gone home? Why risk dropping that kind of revelation in the pews of Windsor? That's the question that lingers. And it's the very question Harry himself seemed to scream without saying the words. Until, of course, he couldn't hold back anymore. But let's unravel this carefully. Because Catherine's whisper wasn't just a whisper. It was a choice. Have you ever been in a moment where you knew time was running out, and silence would do more damage than speech? That's what Catherine faced. For weeks, perhaps even months, rumors had swirled among insiders that Harry wasn't done with his story. Spare had been step one. The second memoir would be the kill shot. And Catherine, who has always seen herself not just as William's wife, but as the monarchy's protector, decided the king had to know immediately. The irony is staggering. Catherine is often painted as the silent one, the poised one, the woman who never lets emotion spill over into action. But here, at this funeral, she broke her own rules. She stepped outside the lines and chose to act. And in acting, she unleashed chaos. Now let's talk about the words themselves. Harry is working on another book. Simple, right? 6 words. But inside those words lived an earthquake. Because if Catherine was right, then Charles was embracing his son 1 week while his son was already preparing a knife behind his back. And if Catherine was wrong, then she had just branded Harry a traitor in the middle of a royal funeral, forever damaging whatever hope of reconciliation remained. Do you see the stakes? And Harry did. That's why his reaction was so volcanic. Shut up, Catherine. That wasn't just a defensive outburst. That was a man who felt cornered, betrayed, exposed in the one place he expected dignity and respect. For Harry, Catherine had crossed an unforgivable line. She had turned his private intentions, or rumors of them, into a weapon against him in front of his father. But here's where it gets more complicated. Some insiders insist Catherine wasn't acting alone, that she had been nudged by senior advisors, even by William himself, to prepare Charles for what might come. Others argue she acted entirely on instinct, fueled by loyalty and fear for the king's fragile position. Which version do you believe? Was Catherine a dutiful protector, or was she playing palace politics? Let's not forget the timeline. Just days before, Harry had been at Clarence's house, reconciling with his father. Smiles, handshakes, maybe even hugs. The newspapers ran with the story of forgiveness. And yet Catherine's whisper turned that reconciliation on its head. Was it genuine, or was it a mask hiding Harry's true plans? That's what makes this so explosive. Because Catherine's words didn't just create tension at a funeral. They reframed everything that came before. They made the reconciliation look suspect. They made Harry look duplicitous. And they made Charles look vulnerable. Now imagine being Charles in that moment. Already weary, already dealing with whispers about his health, already burdened with the crown, and now forced to weigh the truth of Catherine's warning. Do you trust your daughter-in-law, who has never given you reason to doubt her judgment? Or do you trust your son, who once promised to tell his truth, and ended up spilling family secrets that cut you to the bone? That is the dilemma Catherine placed on Charles's shoulders in a matter of seconds. And what about William? Eyewitnesses say his hand tightened on the pew, his knuckles pale, his face frozen. He didn't speak, but his body language spoke volumes. Did he know what Catherine was about to say? Did he silently approve? Or was he, too, stunned by her sudden boldness? Ask yourself this. If your spouse leaned forward and whispered a secret that could upend your family, would you stop them, or would you let the words fall? William let them fall, and Harry heard them. That's why the chapel seemed to shift in that instant. The air grew heavier, the silence sharper. Those closest pretended not to notice, but they noticed. You could feel it, the moment something fragile cracked. Here's the contradiction that makes this moment unforgettable. Catherine whispered because she thought it would prevent devastation. Harry raged because he believed her whisper was the devastation. 2 people, same moment, completely opposite interpretations. Isn't that the definition of family conflict? And then came the aftermath. Harry's outburst, though quiet, was enough to ripple through the pews. Eyes darted, shoulders stiffened, and Charles, the king, sat in the middle, his face a mask of grief mixed with dawning dread. That's when the weight of Catherine's words settled fully. If Harry truly was writing another memoir, then everything, the reconciliation, the fragile peace, the hope of healing, was already shattered. But here's where the plot thickens. Because whispers, once spoken, don't die in silence. They grow. They spread. Catherine's warning didn't stay between her and the king. It became the seed of conversations, suspicions, and confrontations that would follow long after the funeral ended. And Harry? He knew it. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers building, the suspicion taking root. That's why his fury wasn't just about Catherine's words. It was about what came next. Because Catherine's warning wasn't a full stop. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Something no one in that chapel could control. And the moment the service ended, the storm waiting outside those doors would erupt in ways the monarchy wasn't ready for. But before that storm hit, one question lingered in the air like incense. What if Catherine was right? And if she was, then the funeral wasn't the end of an era. It was the beginning of a war. But the real shock? That war wasn't just about a book. It was about survival. And the next move Harry made would leave the monarchy reeling. And that's where the story turns. Because what Harry did after the funeral was even more shocking than Catherine's whisper, and no one, not even Charles, could have predicted it. Harry's fury didn't erupt like a storm with thunder and lightning for all to see. It burned like a fire trapped beneath the surface, glowing hotter by the second until it found a crack to escape. That crack appeared in the unlikeliest of places. A funeral, a place meant for solemn reflection, respect, and quiet unity. And yet, instead of whispers of hymns, there came Harry's voice, sharp and cutting. "Shut up, Catherine. Now stop for a moment." Imagine the weight of those words in that space. You could hear them, even if you weren't close enough to catch them. The energy shifted. People turned their heads, unsure if they had misheard, unsure if it was really him. But Harry's face gave it away. No mask, no royal smile, just fury. Pure, unfiltered fury. And this wasn't the fury of a man caught off guard. No. This was the fury of someone who had been holding in 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 unspoken resentments, until finally, one whisper tipped the scale. But let's break down why that moment mattered so much. Harry wasn't just angry because Catherine had spoken. He was angry because of when and where. In his mind, Catherine had humiliated him, undermined him, painted him as a traitor right in front of the man he had just begun to reconcile with, his father, the king. That was the knife twist. Not the whisper itself, but the timing. Let me ask you, have you ever been caught off guard by someone you thought would protect you, only to realize they were the one who handed you over? That's what Harry felt. Catherine, the woman who once seemed like the calm anchor in the storm of royal drama, had suddenly transformed into his accuser. Not in court, not in the press, but at a funeral, a place of respect, a place where, to him, she had no right to speak those words. And Harry's fury wasn't just about Catherine. It was about the audience. Because though Catherine's whisper was meant for Charles, Harry knew enough people had noticed. He could see the way William stiffened beside her. He could feel the glances darting from other royals nearby. He could almost hear the sound of suspicion beginning to take shape in their minds. In that instant, he wasn't Harry the son or Harry the brother. He was Harry the traitor-in-waiting. That's why the words tumbled out of him. "Shut up, Catherine." Not loud enough to shake the rafters, but loud enough to cut through the sanctity of the service. Loud enough for Charles to hear, for William to hear, for others to sense that the tension had spilled out of its cage. In the aftermath, Catherine froze. Her eyes fixed forward, her body still as stone. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. Because she knew, any response would turn the whisper into a full-blown confrontation. William's hand tightened against the pew, his eyes narrowing but his mouth silent. Charles looked between them, confusion and weariness etched into his face. It was the kind of moment that could collapse into chaos or dissolve into silence. And Catherine, true to form, chose silence. But the damage was already done. Harry seethed. He didn't move, didn't shout further, but his entire presence radiated anger. And that's the thing about fury. You don't always need words to feel it. Sometimes it's in the way someone sits, the way their jaw tightens, the way their eyes refuse to look at anyone else. Those near him described him as burning, a man sitting in fire but refusing to scream. And let's not forget the contradiction here. Harry had just reconciled with his father days earlier. He had smiled. He had spoken of healing. He had given the impression that maybe, just maybe, bridges could be rebuilt. And yet here he was, lashing out in a chapel, his fury aimed not at Charles, not at Camilla, not even at William, but at Catherine, the one person many believed had tried, time and again, to keep peace. Why Catherine? Why her? Because in Harry's mind, she wasn't just whispering to protect Charles. She was weaponizing his own father against him. She was framing him as the enemy even before his father could decide for himself. To Harry, that was unforgivable. And let's talk about optics. Outbursts in public aren't just outbursts when you're a royal. They're headlines. They're body language dissected by experts. They're whispers that turn into front-page scandals. Harry knew that. He'd lived through it. Yet in that moment, his fury was greater than his control. Isn't that telling? Isn't that the sign of how deeply Catherine's words cut him? Ask yourself, when was the last time we saw Harry lose his cool so visibly? In interviews, he's polished. In Spare, he's carefully vulnerable, narrating his pain in a controlled way. But here, this was raw. This was the mask slipping. This was the Harry who had spent years fighting a war inside himself, suddenly exposing that war for everyone in the chapel to see. And Catherine? Her silence was as loud as his fury, because by saying nothing, she let his outburst hang in the air like smoke. She let everyone around them decide for themselves what had just happened. And the truth? That silence made Harry look worse. It made him look like the aggressor, the one who couldn't control himself, the one who confirmed the very whispers Catherine had planted. That's the genius, or the cruelty, of her choice. Was it calculated? Was it instinct? No one knows. But the result was devastating for Harry. In one moment, Catherine whispered, and in the next, Harry shouted. And to the casual observer, that made Catherine look composed and Harry look unhinged. Now, here's the twist you didn't see coming. That outburst didn't just stay inside the chapel. Word spread fast. From lips to ears, from ears to texts, from texts to headlines. By the time the family returned to their cars, journalists were already sniffing around for the story. And within 24 hours, "Shut up, Catherine," wasn't just a moment at a funeral. It was a global headline. But let me leave you with this thought. Harry's fury wasn't just about a whisper. It was about what that whisper represented: betrayal, exposure, humiliation. And in that moment, he realized Catherine wasn't just William's wife or the Princess of Wales. To him, she was the monarchy's weapon. And weapons don't whisper without purpose. But the real question, the one that haunted Harry long after the funeral, was this. Who else knew? Who else had been told of his alleged second memoir? Who else had been turned against him before he even had a chance to speak? And when Harry decided to find out, the consequences would be even more explosive than the funeral itself. Because Catherine's whisper was just the first shot. The war was only beginning. If Spare was a wound, then what Catherine revealed at the Duchess of Kent's funeral was the promise of a knife twisting deeper. Because Harry's rage in that chapel wasn't born in isolation. It was born out of the shadow of Spare, the book that shattered the monarchy's carefully curated image and left scars that still hadn't healed. Let's rewind. January 2023. Harry releases Spare, a memoir unlike anything the royal family had ever endured before. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't polished in the way palace communications usually are. It was raw, blunt, bleeding with pain and anger. And it wasn't just a book, it was an attack. Think about what Spare really did. Harry tore the curtain away from the monarchy, exposing scenes that, until then, were whispered in tabloids or speculated by outsiders. He made them official. He told the world about the physical fight with William, about Charles's coldness, about Camilla's alleged scheming for power. He mocked the stiff traditions, recounted drug use, even exposed personal details no one thought a prince would ever dare to put in print. And the world devoured it. Millions of copies sold. Endless news cycles. Talk shows, interviews, memes, late-night jokes. Harry had gone from being the cheeky Spare to being the whistleblower of Windsor. But here's the thing. Spare didn't just wound the monarchy's image in the press. It fractured something much deeper. Trust. Once trust is broken in a family, it's nearly impossible to put back together. And Catherine knew this. That's why her whisper carried so much weight. Because if Spare was bad, then a second memoir could finish what the first one started. Let me ask you, can you forgive someone once they've betrayed your secrets? Maybe. But can you forgive them if they do it twice? That's the shadow of Spare. It created a new lens through which every royal action was judged. Every smile looked fake. Every handshake seemed forced. Every attempt at reconciliation felt like theater. And Catherine, sitting there at the funeral, knew Charles couldn't afford another performance. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it was. But for Harry, the shadow of Spare was both a burden and a weapon. On one hand, he carried the guilt of knowing his words had cut his family deeply. On the other, he carried the power of knowing his pen was stronger than the monarchy's silence. That contradiction defined him. He was both ashamed and emboldened, both alienated and liberated. And Catherine's whisper threatened to expose that contradiction for what it really was, a ticking bomb. Think of it this way. Spare was Harry's catharsis. It was him telling his truth, no matter the fallout. But a second book? That wouldn't look like truth-telling. That would look like vengeance. And Catherine understood the difference. That's why she couldn't stay silent. And here's where the irony cuts deepest. Harry thought Spare was his story to own. But once it was published, it no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the world, to the media, to his critics and supporters alike. Catherine's warning at the funeral showed that even his family now saw him through the shadow of that book. He wasn't just Harry anymore. He was Harry, the man who might betray them again at any moment. And doesn't that make his fury more understandable? Imagine being defined by your past words, unable to shake them, unable to move forward because everyone assumes you'll strike again. For Harry, Catherine's whisper wasn't about a second memoir. It was about the cage Spare had built around him. But the shadow of Spare wasn't only personal. It was political. Within the palace, advisors were said to be in panic mode after its release. Strategies to rehabilitate Charles's image, to shore up William's popularity, to protect Camilla from backlash, it was all-consuming. Every headline, every royal engagement, every speech was carefully calibrated to counter the damage Harry had done. And yet here was Catherine, warning that all of that work could be undone with one more book. One more round of Harry's truth. And the cruelest part? Spare had been a bestseller. A second memoir would sell even more. The monarchy knew it. Harry knew it. And Catherine knew Charles couldn't survive it. Not politically, not emotionally. Now let me ask you directly. Do you think Harry knew the shadow of Spare was still haunting him? Or do you think he believed reconciliation had erased it? That's the contradiction again. He wanted to move forward, but the past wasn't done with him. And Catherine's whisper dragged that past right back into the present. And what about the public? The world had been shocked by Spare, but many had also sympathized. They saw Harry as a wounded man speaking out against an institution that crushed individuality. But sympathy is fragile. Do it once, and people may applaud your courage. Do it twice, and they may call it obsession. That's the risk Harry faced. Catherine knew it. And in her eyes, she wasn't just protecting Charles. She was protecting Harry from himself. But here's the twist. Catherine's warning didn't feel protective to Harry. It felt like betrayal. And that's why his fury burned so hot. Because once again, the shadow of Spare wasn't just following him. It was being used against him. And this raises the most haunting question of all. Was Catherine right? Was Harry truly working on a second memoir? Or were the rumors exaggerated, twisted by palace gossip and press speculation? If she was right, then she saved Charles from walking blind into disaster. If she was wrong, then she condemned Harry for a crime he hadn't even committed. Either way, the damage was done. And Catherine's whisper ensured that the shadow of Spare grew darker, larger, heavier. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a curse. But here's the chilling part. While Catherine believed she was shielding the king from betrayal, she may have also sparked the very fury that would make betrayal inevitable. Because what do cornered men do? They lash out. They fight back. They make the threat real, even if it wasn't before. And Harry? He was about to prove that point. Because the shadow of Spare was only the beginning. The real danger was what Harry would do next. And what he did, after that funeral, would leave the monarchy scrambling in ways they had never anticipated. Rumors. They spread faster than truth, don't they? Especially when it comes to the royal family. And when Catherine whispered to King Charles that Harry was working on another memoir, she wasn't conjuring that fear out of thin air. She was echoing whispers that had been circulating in publishing circles, in palace corridors, and in the darker corners of media speculation for months. Let's ask the obvious question. Why would Harry risk it? Why would he even consider writing a second memoir after the firestorm Spare unleashed? He had exposed childhood trauma, family feuds, his military past, even his frostbitten anatomy. What else could there possibly be left to reveal? And yet the rumors insisted that he wasn't finished, that there were entire chapters of his life, entire stories left untold, stories so explosive they were left out of spare because the timing wasn't right. And that's where this gets fascinating. Because in the world of publishing, timing is everything. Think of Spare as part one of a two-act play. The first act shocked the audience, left them gasping. The second act? That's the one that leaves them reeling, unable to forget. So what were these rumors pointing to? What could possibly be left unsaid? Some insiders whispered that Harry had held back certain stories about his mother, about Diana's final days, her fears, and her suspicions about the very institution she once married into. Others suggested there were darker, more detailed accounts of Camilla's maneuvering to secure her place beside Charles. And then, of course, there were whispers of William, stories of rivalries, clashes, and betrayals that never made it to print the first time around. But the most dangerous rumor of all, that Harry was saving the most devastating revelations for when Charles was firmly on the throne. That the book Catherine hinted at would not just be Harry's personal catharsis, it would be a weapon. Now let me put this question to you directly. Would Harry really do it? Would he really risk detonating another bomb under the family that had already exiled him emotionally, if not officially? The answer, perhaps, depends on what you believe motivates him. Is it money? After all, Spare was one of the fastest-selling nonfiction books in history. A second memoir would guarantee millions more in advances and royalties. Or is it revenge? Was Spare only the first shot in a longer campaign against the institution he believes destroyed his mother and suffocated his youth? Or, and here's the contradiction that makes this so compelling, was it neither? Was Harry simply telling his truth in installments, pacing his story because one book could never contain it all? Think about it. Spare left gaps. Entire periods of his life barely mentioned. Key events hinted at, but not fleshed out. That wasn't an accident. Authors don't leave gaps unless they intend to fill them later. And the publishing industry knew it. Executives had already begun to circle, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Whispers of meetings in California, conversations about follow-up deals, ghostwriters ready to sign NDAs. The appetite was there. The question was whether Harry would feed it. And that's why Catherine's whisper mattered so much. Because to Charles, to William, to the monarchy itself, the possibility of another memoir wasn't just idle gossip. It was existential. One book had hurt them. Two could destroy them. But here's where the rumors take an even darker turn. Some said the second memoir wasn't just about Harry. It was about Meghan too. Stories she wanted told. Stories that would cement her as the victim and the heroine of their saga. Imagine the impact of that. Harry's voice amplified by Meghan's perspective, creating a double-barreled narrative that no palace PR machine could counter. And yet, here's the irony. The louder the rumors grew, the less Harry said. Publicly, he remained vague. Interviews where he danced around questions. Statements that left doors open without confirming anything. That silence only made the whispers grow louder. After all, if he wasn't planning another book, why not deny it outright? Why leave everyone guessing? Because mystery sells. And Harry knew it. Now let's talk about the emotional toll. For Charles, these rumors were torture. Every smile Harry gave, every hug, every step toward reconciliation was shadowed by the question, is he genuine, or is he gathering material? Imagine that. Imagine reconciling with your child while wondering if every word you speak could end up in print. That's the prison Catherine was trying to save Charles from. And Harry? He saw it differently. To him, the rumors weren't a sign of his betrayal. They were a sign of the monarchy's paranoia. They couldn't believe he might simply want peace. They assumed every move he made was a setup for another ambush. That suspicion, in his eyes, proved everything he had said in Spare. Do you see the cycle here? Rumors fueling suspicion. Suspicion fueling anger. Anger fueling more rumors. That's why the second memoir wasn't just speculation. It was poison. Poison spreading through the royal family, seeping into every interaction, every reconciliation, every fragile smile. And here's the part that makes your heart stop. Some palace aides reportedly told Catherine that the second memoir could be the end. Not just the end of Harry's relationship with his father, but the end of Charles's reign as we know it. Because if Harry's pen tore too deep, public trust in the monarchy could collapse. Think about that. 1,000 years of history, undone not by abdication or war, but by the words of a son who decided he had nothing left to lose. And Catherine knew it. That's why she whispered. That's why Harry burned with fury. Because those 6 words, "Harry is working on another book," were more than a warning. They were a prophecy. But prophecies are dangerous. Because once they're spoken, they have a way of coming true. And Catherine's words would set into motion events no one in that chapel could stop. Because what happened after the funeral would prove that the rumors weren't just rumors. They were the beginning of something far darker. Fragile. That's the word that kept circling in whispers around Buckingham Palace and Clarence House. Fragile not just in body, but in reputation. King Charles, already carrying the weight of the crown at an age where most men would be long retired, was suddenly being told, by his daughter-in-law, no less, that his youngest son might be preparing another blow. And this time, the blow wouldn't just bruise. It could break. Let's pause here and ask the question that matters. How much more can one man endure? Think of Charles's journey. A lifetime in waiting. Decades spent in the shadow of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history. He had been mocked for his awkwardness, criticized for his personal life, and written off as irrelevant by some. And yet, when Elizabeth passed, the world turned its eyes to him. Suddenly, he was the king. Suddenly, his every word, every movement, every expression carried the weight of the crown. And then came the whispers. Health scares. Quiet reports of exhaustion, of treatment schedules, of his doctors urging him to slow down. His aides brushing it off as routine, while insiders admitted that stress was eating at him. And can you blame them? Because it wasn't just the duties of kingship pressing down on Charles. It was his family, his sons, his fractured bloodline. Now imagine this. Catherine leans in at the Duchess of Kent's funeral and tells him Harry is preparing another book. For Charles, it wasn't just bad news. It was a ticking time bomb strapped directly to his reputation. Why? Because reputations in monarchies aren't like reputations for ordinary men. They aren't just about perception. They're about survival. A monarch's reputation is the monarchy. If the king is seen as weak, the crown itself looks weak. If the king is seen as cruel, the crown looks cruel. And if the king is seen as betrayed by his own son, again, what does that say about the future of the monarchy? Think about the contradiction. Only a week before the funeral, Charles and Harry had supposedly reconciled at Clarence House. Smiles, warm words, headlines suggesting healing. And yet Catherine's whisper turned that narrative upside down. If Harry was truly working on another memoir, then that reconciliation was nothing more than theater, a performance to make Charles look like a father regaining his son, when in reality, the knife was already being sharpened. Now let me ask you this. How do you govern a nation? How do you represent stability when you can't even trust the embrace of your own son? That's the pressure Charles faced. A fragile reputation, already tested by scandals. His affair with Camilla, once despised by the public, still lingers in memory even as she sits beside him as queen. His handling of Andrew, still criticized as weak and indecisive. His long-standing image as a man too emotional, too sensitive, too awkward for the role. And now this, another potential betrayal from Harry, one that could reopen all those old wounds in the public eye. And Catherine's timing? Ruthless, some might say. Necessary, others would argue. Because in her mind, the king's health and reputation were one and the same. Stress Charles, and you weaken him physically. Expose him publicly, and you weaken the monarchy institutionally. Catherine wasn't just speaking as a daughter-in-law. She was speaking as a guardian of the crown. But Harry didn't see it that way. In his fury, he saw Catherine not as a protector, but as an attacker. As the one pouring poison into his father's ear, branding him a traitor before he even had the chance to explain or deny. For Harry, Catherine's whisper wasn't about Charles's health. It was about silencing him before he could tell his story. And that contradiction tore the family apart even further. Because here's the bitter truth. Both could be right. Catherine might have been saving Charles from collapse. Harry might have been cornered into becoming exactly what she accused him of. Let's step back and consider the bigger picture. Charles's reign had barely begun, yet cracks were already showing. His approval ratings were softer than his mother's. Younger generations questioned the monarchy's relevance altogether, and whispers of his health only amplified the doubt. If Harry really was preparing another memoir, packed with revelations about his father, his stepmother, his brother, even his late mother Diana. Then Charles's reign might not survive the first 5 years. That's why Catherine's whisper landed with such force. It wasn't just family drama. It was a matter of state, a matter of survival. And here's the irony. Charles, the man who spent his whole life waiting for the throne, now had to fight to keep it from collapsing under the weight of his own son's words. Words that hadn't even been written yet, but which already carried the power of destruction. Now picture this. The king sits stiffly in his pew, Catherine's whisper still in his ear, Harry's anger radiating from across the aisle. His chest tight, his mind racing. The cameras show a man in mourning, but inside? Inside, he's wondering if the monarchy itself can withstand another strike. And here's the chilling question that Catherine's warning left hanging in the air. Would Harry's next book kill more than Charles's reputation? Would it kill the monarchy itself? Because one truth was becoming undeniable. The monarchy didn't fear Harry's smile. It didn't fear his interviews. It didn't even fear his absence. It feared his pen. And that pen, sharpened once and spare, might soon carve again. But before Charles could even process Catherine's warning, before Harry's fury could cool, the world outside those chapel doors was about to explode with speculation. And once the press got wind of the tension inside, the fragile mask of unity the monarchy tried to maintain would be torn away. And what happened next would prove that Catherine's whisper wasn't just a moment of fear. It was the spark of a firestorm. Reconciliation. That word had been splashed across headlines only days before the Duchess of Kent's funeral. For a brief moment, it seemed like the impossible had happened. Prince Harry and King Charles had sat down face-to-face at Clarence House and found common ground. After years of icy silence, after spare and interviews that cut the monarchy to its core, there had been talk of a thaw. Smiles, handshakes, maybe even tears. But was it real? Or was it just another performance, staged for appearances, while underneath the surface the wound was festering? That's the contradiction that hangs over this chapter. Clarence House, Charles's London residence, had always been a place of both comfort and conflict. For Charles, it was his refuge, the place where he had once nurtured his private life with Camilla before the world was ready to accept her. For Harry, it was the backdrop of countless childhood memories, moments of closeness with his father, but also moments of cold distance. To reconcile there wasn't just symbolic, it was loaded. So what really happened in that meeting? Insiders described it as emotional, intimate, raw. Charles, weary from both the crown and his private health concerns, reportedly opened the door with tears in his eyes. Harry, carrying the burden of his self-imposed exile in California, hesitated before stepping inside. The two men sat down in the drawing room, the walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had survived scandals, wars, and betrayals of their own. Imagine the weight of that history pressing down on them as they spoke. Charles began with what he knew best, duty. He reminded Harry of the crown's responsibility, of the centuries of legacy that depended on unity. But then, slowly, he shifted into the language of fatherhood. He spoke not as king, but as dad. About missing his son. About missing his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, whom he barely knew. He reached for Harry's hand. And Harry? For a moment, he let the mask slip. The hardened anger that had fueled Spare, the defensiveness that had carried him through interviews, gave way to something else, vulnerability. He told his father about the loneliness he felt, about the weight of leaving the royal fold, about how America's sunshine hadn't erased the shadows of his childhood. For the first time in years, it seemed like father and son were speaking not as enemies, but as family. Let me ask you, do you believe reconciliation can happen in a single meeting? Or is it always a process, fragile and easily broken? Because what Catherine whispered at the funeral suggests this fragile reconciliation may have been more illusion than reality. Here's the cruel irony. Only days before Catherine's whisper, the tabloids were running with headlines about Harry's surprise visit to Clarence House. Some said it was Meghan who encouraged it, believing Harry needed closure with his father. Others claimed it was Charles who reached out, fearful that time, and his health, were running short. Either way, the optics were powerful. The estranged prince walking once again through the gates of Clarence House, welcomed by his father, the king. And the public ate it up. Photos of Harry arriving in London. Rumors of a private dinner. talk of a new beginning. But behind closed doors, the truth was far murkier. Because reconciliation, as it turned out, was fragile. It was built on shaky ground. And Catherine's whisper at the funeral cracked that ground wide open. Why? Because if Harry was truly working on another memoir, then everything that had just unfolded at Clarence House wasn't reconciliation. It was a performance. A smokescreen. A chance for Harry to gather more stories, more truths to put on paper. And Charles, vulnerable, had played right into it. Now imagine the devastation Catherine's words must have caused Charles in that pew. Days earlier, he had looked into his son's eyes and seen hope. And now, he was being told that same son was sharpening his pen for another attack. Do you see why Harry's fury burned so hot? Catherine wasn't just calling him a traitor. She was calling his reconciliation with his father a lie. And that brings us to the emotional core of this chapter. For Charles, Clarence House represented a rare moment of healing. For Harry, it represented a chance to be seen not as the spare, not as the runaway prince, but as a son. But for Catherine, Clarence House may have been a mirage, a dangerous illusion threatening to lull the king into complacency while Harry plotted another strike. Ask yourself this: who was right? Was Clarence House genuine? Or was it theater? Because the truth is, even the insiders don't agree. Some swore they saw tears, real tears, streaming down Charles's face. Others insist Harry left the meeting cold, unsatisfied, already thinking of the next move. And then there's the most haunting possibility of all, that both things were true, that the reconciliation was real, but temporary. A fleeting moment of warmth destined to collapse under the weight of suspicion and whispers. And that's what makes this chapter so painful. Because in another world, Clarence House could have been the turning point. The place where father and son finally put the past behind them. The place where the monarchy found healing instead of more division. But Catherine's whisper ensured that reconciliation was seen not as salvation, but as deception. The contradiction is brutal. For Charles, Clarence House was a memory of love. For Harry, it was a fragile truce. For Catherine, it was a trap waiting to spring. And for the monarchy, it was a story that could go either way, hope or betrayal. And here's the twist that takes us forward. After Clarence House, Harry believed he had finally made progress with his father. That's why Catherine's whisper at the funeral cut so deep. It wasn't just betrayal. It was sabotage. In his eyes, Catherine destroyed the very thing he had fought to rebuild. But Catherine saw it differently. She believed she was saving Charles from being blindsided, saving the monarchy from being humiliated once again. In her mind, Clarence House wasn't reconciliation. It was a trapdoor waiting to snap open beneath the king's feet. So who was right? Was Catherine the protector or the saboteur? Was Harry the prodigal son or the Trojan horse? Those questions hung in the air long after the funeral ended. And the answers would determine the next phase of this war. Because Clarence House wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And the very next move, between Catherine and Harry, would take the family feud from whispers to open warfare. Catherine versus Harry. Sister-in-law versus brother-in-law. Two people bound by family ties, but divided by something far deeper: loyalty, truth, and the future of the crown. If Clarence House had been the stage for reconciliation, then the funeral became the arena for confrontation. And Catherine's whisper wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of battle. Let's start with this. Catherine and Harry were never truly allies. Oh, in the early days, there were smiles, there were laughs, there were carefully staged photos that made it seem as if they were close. Catherine, gracious as always, welcomed Meghan into the fold, stood beside Harry in public events, played the part of the warm sister-in-law. But behind closed doors, the tension was there. Why? Because Catherine had always represented the crown's stability, while Harry had always represented its rebellion. Catherine was the dutiful daughter-in-law, mastering the art of silence, sacrifice, and public composure. Harry was the loose cannon, the truth-teller, the one willing to expose family secrets no matter the cost. Their roles were destined to clash. And clash they did. Spare had already exposed Catherine in ways that stung. Remember the story of Meghan and Catherine fighting over bridesmaids' dresses? Catherine painted as cold, rigid, unwilling to bend. Meghan painted as the victim. For Catherine, that wasn't just embarrassing. It was a violation. Because she had built her entire public identity on being calm, kind, and diplomatic. And Harry had put her in the book as something else entirely. So when Catherine leaned over to Charles at the funeral and whispered about a second memoir, it wasn't just about protecting the king. It was personal. It was Catherine drawing a line in the sand, saying, "Enough is enough." Now let me ask you, what happens when a woman who has kept silent for years finally decides to speak? That's what Catherine did that day. And Harry, sitting only feet away, knew it. He knew she had shifted from passive to active, from peacemaker to defender. And to him, that wasn't loyalty. That was betrayal. But here's where the contradiction makes this story even more explosive. Catherine wasn't just speaking as herself. She was speaking as the future queen. Every word she whispered carried the weight of the crown. She wasn't just warning Charles. She was positioning herself as the monarchy's shield. Harry saw it as meddling. Catherine saw it as duty. And the clash didn't end in the chapel. Sources say that after the service, when the family retreated behind closed doors, the tension between Catherine and Harry boiled over. Harry accused her of poisoning Charles against him. Catherine, with William by her side, accused Harry of planning another betrayal and pretending reconciliation was real. The exchange, described by one insider as cold and cutting, left the entire family shaken. Let's pause here. Imagine the dynamics in that room. William, protective of Catherine, standing tall, jaw clenched. Catherine, calm but unflinching, refusing to back down. Harry, eyes blazing, feeling cornered. And Charles, caught in the middle, the weight of his crown suddenly heavier than ever. Who do you side with? The sister-in-law protecting the king? Or the son furious at being accused of betrayal without proof? It's Shakespearean, isn't it? Family against family, loyalty against truth, whispers against fury. And here's the irony. Catherine and Harry are, in some ways, mirrors of each other. Both have spoken out when they believed silence was dangerous. Both have defied the expectations placed on them. The difference? Catherine did it quietly, in a whisper at a funeral. Harry did it loudly, in a book read by millions. Same instinct, different execution, and that difference turned them into enemies. But let's not forget Meghan, because her shadow loomed over this clash too. Harry's anger wasn't just his own. It was fueled by years of feeling that Meghan had been mistreated, misunderstood, cast out by the very family Catherine represents. To Harry, Catherine wasn't just whispering about him. She was whispering about them, about Meghan, about their children, about everything he had built outside the monarchy. That's why his rage burned so hot. And Catherine? She saw Meghan as the catalyst of Harry's rebellion. The woman who had encouraged him to write Spare, to speak out, to separate himself from the family. In Catherine's mind, whispering to Charles wasn't just about Harry. It was about countering Meghan's influence too. Ask yourself this. Is it possible for two people, bound by family, to ever find common ground again after such a clash? Or is the relationship doomed forever? Because what happened at the funeral wasn't just a disagreement. It was a fracture. A fracture that may never heal. Catherine versus Harry became the headline, the narrative, the story everyone was talking about. And in that clash, the monarchy's future became even more uncertain. But here's the twist. While Catherine may have won the battle in the chapel, her composure against Harry's fury, the war was far from over. Because Harry still had something Catherine could never control, his story, his words, his pen, and Catherine's whisper, instead of silencing him, may have given him the very reason to write again. That's the cruel irony. By trying to stop him, she may have ensured he would never stop. And as the family left the funeral, the world saw only somber faces, black clothes, and bowed heads. But behind those faces, a war was raging. And the next chapter in that war would not be whispered. It would be shouted. Because Meghan's silence in all of this was about to end. And when it did, the clash between Catherine and Harry would look like only the beginning. Silence. Sometimes it screams louder than words. And in the storm that followed Catherine's whisper and Harry's fury, one figure loomed larger by what she didn't say than by what she ever could have said. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, Harry's wife, his confidant, his co-architect of life outside the palace walls. At the funeral, she was absent, but her absence was its own presence, her silence its own voice, and everyone in that chapel knew it. Let me ask you, what's more dangerous, an enemy who speaks, or an ally who stays quiet? Because Meghan's silence in that moment wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Think about the optics. Meghan had skipped the Duchess of Kent's funeral. To some, it was respect, staying out of the spotlight, letting Harry face his family without the added layer of tension her presence always seemed to ignite. To others, it was defiance, another sign she wanted no part in the rituals of a family that never truly accepted her. But to insiders, her absence was tactical. Meghan knew the funeral wasn't the place to make a stand. But she also knew Harry would feel her presence even without her being there. He would carry her voice in his ear, her influence in his mind. And that's where the story gets darker. Because Catherine may have whispered in Charles's ear, but Meghan had been whispering in Harry's for years, encouraging him to speak his truth, to break the silence, to tell the world what really went on behind palace walls. Spare wasn't just Harry's book, it was their book, their story, their reclamation of power. So when Catherine accused Harry of plotting a second memoir, was she really accusing Harry? Or was she accusing Meghan? Now consider this. Meghan's entire life after leaving the monarchy has revolved around building narratives. The Oprah interview, the Netflix series, public speeches, advocacy, brand building. Every move she and Harry have made has been about controlling the story before the palace could control it for them. And Catherine knew it. That's why her whisper was as much about Meghan as it was about Harry. She feared Meghan's influence, Meghan's silence, Meghan's ability to push Harry into doing what he might hesitate to do alone. Ask yourself this. Would Harry really go ahead with another book without Meghan's blessing? Without her encouragement? Without her strategy guiding the way? That's the irony. Harry may be the royal, the prince, the son of the king. But Meghan has become the strategist, the architect of their new life. And Catherine, standing as the protector of the monarchy, saw Meghan as the true danger, not Harry's pen, but the hand that guided it. And here's where the contradictions collide. Meghan's silence at the funeral was read by some as respect, by others as rebellion. But to Harry, it was strength. He saw her as the one person who stood outside the chaos, untouched by the whispers, unbroken by the tension. To him, her absence was proof that she was above it all. But to Catherine, it was proof of her manipulation, proof that Meghan didn't need to be in the room to stir the storm. And isn't that chilling? Meghan wasn't there, yet every move Catherine and Harry made circled back to her influence. Her silence was the shadow over the chapel. Let's not forget the power dynamics here. Catherine represents the monarchy. Meghan represents the outsider who challenged it and left. Both women are, in their own way, symbols of how the monarchy survives or collapses. Catherine embodies tradition, loyalty, restraint. Meghan embodies disruption, independence, narrative power. And Harry? He's the rope in the tug-of-war between them, pulled one way by Catherine's whispers, another by Meghan's silence. Now here's the twist. In the days following the funeral, speculation swirled. Meghan, silent in public, was said to be furious in private. Furious that Catherine had dared to expose Harry in that moment. Furious that whispers of a second memoir were being pinned not only on Harry, but on her influence. Reports claimed she told Harry, "They'll never let you live in peace. So tell the story anyway." Do you see the cycle forming? Catherine whispered to stop the book. Meghan, in her silence, may have encouraged it to happen. Catherine wanted to protect the monarchy. Meghan wanted to protect Harry. And in her eyes, protecting him meant letting him tell everything, no matter the cost. And the press, of course, fed on it. Headlines about Catherine versus Meghan exploded again, reigniting the rivalry narrative that had dominated for years. The press didn't care that Meghan wasn't at the funeral. They didn't care that she hadn't spoken a word. Her silence became the story. What will Meghan say? What does Meghan think? Where is Meghan? And that's the brilliance. And the danger of silence. It forces the world to fill in the blanks. But here's where the emotional beat hits hardest. Harry, caught in the middle, began to unravel. To him, Catherine's whisper was betrayal. To him, Meghan's silence was loyalty. But what happens when loyalty pushes you further toward destruction? What happens when the person you trust most encourages you to strike again? Even as the family you left behind warns that another strike could collapse the crown itself. That's where Harry found himself. Torn between Catherine's warning and Meghan's silence. Torn between protecting his father or protecting his wife. Torn between reconciliation and revenge. And that's why Catherine versus Harry wasn't just Catherine versus Harry. It was Catherine versus Meghan. The future queen versus the outsider duchess. The monarchy versus the rebel. Two women shaping the choices of one man who might hold the monarchy's survival in his hands. And that clash? It wasn't going to stay silent for long, because Meghan's silence wouldn't last forever. And when she finally broke it, the storm Catherine had tried to prevent would look like nothing compared to the one Meghan was about to unleash. Breaking point. That's where the monarchy was headed. You could feel it in the silence of the chapel after Catherine's whisper. You could sense it in Harry's fury, in Charles's weariness, in William's clenched jaw. And you could see it in the way the press circled outside Windsor like vultures waiting for a carcass. The monarchy, once seen as untouchable, unshakable, eternal, was beginning to look fragile. And Catherine's 6 words, "Harry is working on another book," were the trigger. But let's be honest. The monarchy has faced storms before. Wars, abdications, divorces, Diana's tragic death, scandals involving Andrew. And every time, it found a way to survive. So why did this feel different? Why did this whisper at a funeral feel like the crack that could bring the whole institution down? The answer is simple. This time, the threat wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't a foreign war or a political movement or a scandal the palace could bury with silence. It was coming from inside, from a son, a brother, a prince who knew every secret, every weakness, every vulnerable thread in the monarchy's carefully woven fabric. And his pen was sharper than any sword. Ask yourself this. How does an institution built on secrecy survive when one of its own decides to make secrecy his weapon? That's what Harry represented. And that's why Catherine's whisper carried so much weight. She wasn't just tattling. She was ringing an alarm bell. Now imagine the monarchy as a house of glass. For centuries, it has shined brilliantly, reflecting tradition, stability, and continuity. But cracks have always been there, hidden, patched over, ignored. Diana's revelations. Andrew's disgrace. Even Charles's affair with Camilla. Each crack made the glass weaker. And then came Spare. A hammer swung from the inside. A hammer that shattered parts of the glass, but somehow left the house standing. And now, Catherine warned that Harry was picking up the hammer again. Another blow. And this one might not leave the house standing at all. This is why insiders spoke of a breaking point. Because another memoir, another round of betrayal, could destroy more than just reputations. It could destroy the crown itself. Think about Charles's position. His reign had barely begun. He was already facing doubts about his age, his health, his ability to connect with a younger generation that increasingly questioned the monarchy's relevance. And now, whispers of a second book threatened to turn his son into the crown's greatest enemy. How do you rule a nation when your own blood threatens to make you look like a fraud? And William? The heir. The man expected to carry the monarchy into the future. For him, Catherine's whisper wasn't just about Charles. It was about his own destiny. Because if Harry released another book, if the monarchy's reputation collapsed under its weight, William's future crown could be tarnished before it ever touched his head. Imagine being told your brother might burn down the very house you're supposed to inherit. That's not just betrayal. That's existential. Now let's talk about the public. Because at the end of the day, monarchies survive on one thing: public trust. The people have to believe the crown represents stability, dignity, and continuity. And yet, after Spare, trust was already shaken. Another memoir could turn cracks into collapse. The people wouldn't see a family holding steady. They'd see a family at war with itself. A monarchy crumbling under the weight of its own secrets. Ask yourself, how many more betrayals can the public stomach before they decide the crown isn't worth saving? And then there's Catherine. Her whisper at the funeral wasn't just about loyalty to Charles. It was about protecting the monarchy from reaching that breaking point. She saw the cracks. She felt the fragility. And she knew one more blow could be fatal. That's why she risked everything to speak. But Harry? He saw it differently. He believed Catherine's whisper created the breaking point. That she turned suspicion into certainty, reconciliation into paranoia. That by speaking those 6 words, she accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. And here's the haunting contradiction. Both may be true. Catherine's warning may have been necessary. But in delivering it, she also deepened the fracture. This is the tragedy of the monarchy's breaking point. It wasn't caused by one book, one whisper, one outburst. It was the accumulation of decades of secrets, scandals, betrayals, and silences. And Catherine's whisper was simply the moment when the weight became too much to bear. So what